We just had one of the best ban lists I've seen in the last decade. Not only did some of the best decks of the format get hit, but some of the most degenerate cards of last format are gone as well. Today we're going to be going over some of the decks you might consider playing in this upcoming format. Not only that, we'll talk about some of the tech cards and the popular engines that I could see being played, but we'll also give a little insight into the future sets and how it might impact the meta. It's been a while and I'm so excited, so let's get into it. So I'm super excited for this format. Not only are some of the same decks going to be around, but since the power level of everything has been weakened, so many other decks have the chance to compete going into this format. So the first deck I wanted to talk about is a pretty obvious one. It's the Ryziel deck. Now with so many of the cards semi-limited, cards like 7th Tachyon are basically going to be staple. Going into this format, don't be surprised to be running into Ryziel. Again, there's no reason to really put this deck down. Detonator to 1 is a little frustrating, so you have to keep that in mind. But functionally, the deck does exactly the same thing. Of course, again, you don't have Dweller, so you lose a little bit of your toolbox. And again, with 7th Tachyon, you can make up some of the consistency you lost. Whether it's playing some of the light rank 4s to help search your level 4 lights from your deck to your hand, this will get you access to some of your best starters or extenders in the deck, but also, of course, you can still play stuff like the Ragnar Zero to play the Shark cards as more engine for your deck, while also getting the utility of playing the Archfiend to be able to search out stuff like Lancia, because Malice is still going to be in this format. But of course, this deck is known for so many different engines being able to be splashed inside of it. Something that's hilarious is also this deck can now abuse MathMech Circular. Whether or not this is going to be the route the deck goes, I'm not too sure personally, but it is pretty cool that this deck does have that option, because at the end of the day, the best engine in the game right now, to nobody's surprise, is going to be Fiendsmith. It went untouched on the ban list. Not to mention, there are now less Bestials in the format as well, with Druid's Worm going to 1. But of course, that's not the only engines that this deck can play. Don't forget about the Mitsurugi cards as well. Who knows, maybe we get more support down the line, but even without it, this engine's really amazing. And while it does make your deck weaker to something like Droll Bird, hands down, these are some of the funnest cards and really strong going into this format. So if you want to try this out, I definitely suggest it, and don't be surprised if other people take this route as well. Obviously, it's just Ryziel, it's nothing crazy, but the fact that the deck has options makes it really fun coming into this format. Another thing to note is that post-Alliance Insight, the deck will also get access to Star Ryziel, an amazing card for the deck. Not only is it another extender, but it helps you search your spells and traps, getting you early access to Cross without having to go through Duo Drive. That being said, a card that might be popular that we've seen in the OCG for the Ryziel deck will actually be Infernal Flame Banshee, because it can search Pyros. Thanks to Star Ryziel, now there's going to be lines where you can get access to Cross before you even go into your Duo Drive, and Banshee can help you get there. Just more options and more lines when playing around and through hand traps for this deck, so it's going to be a lot of fun to experiment with. If you don't have one of these already, I suggest you pick them up. They're pretty cheap, especially if you're looking into the Ryziel deck. Another deck that's going to be pretty obvious to see this format, it's going to be the Malice deck. All the main starters got hit to 2, but there are so many different ways that you can mitigate that consistency problem. You could just simply add Allure of Darkness with more of the Chessy Cat, but don't forget all of these are Cybers as well, so you could opt to play something like Cynet Mining. Obviously, it's vulnerable to something like Ash Blossom, but it feels really awkward to Ash this because there are times where you want to hold it for the Malice traps. But another thing to note is if you do decide to run Cynet Mining, now you can also include MathMech Circular. Weird, a powerful card comes off the ban list and it appears in a few of the top contending decks, but this is just an amazing extender and potentially a starter for some of your combos as well. I'm very excited to see if this is something that sticks around in the Malice deck, especially post Insight, because there's a lot of Cyber support that not only could be played in this deck, but so many other decks as well. That being said, obviously you would probably still be playing Bestials in this deck, but I will say post Alliance, you do get a new Malice monster that is essentially a Bestial on your turn, but again, it's for your own Malice card, so you can proc your own effects during your opponent's turn. I still think the Bestials will find a place in this deck, especially with other decks in the format that are lights and darks. But also, don't be surprised, as I mentioned, the Fiendsmiths are just another engine that you could potentially see in this deck. Again, it's just one of the strongest engines in the game, and it's hindered in the OCG, and that's why you don't see it in Malice decks. But another thing to consider that the deck used to do was playing the Kashtira cards. Very strong in this deck, and I will talk more about the Kashtiras in a sec, but they do kind of conflict with the Bestials, which are very strong in this deck, so you have to kind of pick and choose what you want to approach with. But that being said, the Kashtira cards are really amazing, especially coming into this format, not just because the Fiendsmith cards are so popular, and these are just free bodies to help you link into those, but also with Detonator going to 1, and of course Malice playing a lot of 1-ofs in their extra deck, Unicorn becomes a powerhouse this format and so annoying for different decks to have to deal with. I definitely think this package, or at least the Unicorn lineup, finds a spot in one of these top decks coming into this format. Post-Alliance Insight, we're also getting a wide array of cyber support with the Adignisters, but hands down, the Malice deck is looking to be like one of the best decks going into next format. And I don't know if you've read the Access Code Talker at Ignister, but the card's crazy, and Omni Negate that banishes, so good for any Cybers deck. It's gonna be amazing. Now, we've talked about the Fiendsmith engine being so good in different decks, but being its own standalone deck alongside stuff like the Kashtira engine saw a lot of popularity at the start of last format, and going into this format, before we get into Alliance Insight, I actually think this is the all reliable of the format, where you just play good stuff cards, a bunch of non-engine, and just getting a couple of bodies on the field can put up multiple interruptions thanks to the Fiendsmith cards. The deck grinds like no other, and again, it's very low to the ground, but it's very consistent. Plus, it gets to play some of the best engines in the game because that's really all the deck is. Again, these engines can be paired in a multitude of decks, but I just wanted to mention the fact that you could just play this as a deck by itself. Don't forget, there's also the Magical Musketeer deck as well. Basically a pure Fiendsmith deck with another little spice thrown in, but keep an eye out. I definitely think that's another thing that if you really wanted to, you could go into this format playing. Now, one deck I'm really looking forward to playing in this upcoming format is going to be the Blue Eyes deck. Even pre-ban list, I've had a lot of fun experimenting with this deck, and while there's not much that changes post-ban list for this deck, the fact that this deck was already competing pre-ban list with all these top tier decks really leads me to believe that this deck will have success at least at the start of this format before we get into Alliance Insight. That being said, this deck can use some of the Regenesis cards as well, so maybe that's something we look into. But again, you're looking at a deck that not only can abuse the Bestials, but we've recently seen the Fiendsmith engine make its way into the deck as well. Of all the decks we've talked about so far, this has been the one that I've actually had the most fun with. And aside from the Primite cards, the deck is super budget friendly, so don't be surprised at the start of the format if you see it running around everywhere. I mean, heck, I'll probably be playing it as well. The deck is just so much fun to play. Now, one of the decks that does not play Fiendsmith cards that I'm very excited to experiment with is the Mermail Atlantean deck. Sure, we lost Bahamut, so we don't have Toad, and with the lack of Dweller, it's gonna make it to where this deck can play a lot easier, but now you have to find a generic rank 4 that you can detach for your Dragoons to trigger. I believe there's like a rank 4 called like Snowdust Giant or something of that nature. The card effectively does nothing, but it's a rank 4 water that can detach, so again, whether or not the deck has to go that way, we'll see. But going first, you still have lines to get into your barrier statue, and of course the Minstrel to rip cards out of your opponent's hand. Don't forget there's Mullen Glacia as well, and of course there's so many combos you could still do with your Coelacanth. Whether or not we go that route still, it's definitely an option, especially because there's so many different synchro lines that we can now approach with as well. I don't see a reason why this deck can't succeed, at least in the early iterations of this format pre-Alliance Insight. And again, I might be a little biased because I have a lot of shiny cardboard from back in the day as well for this deck, but I'm looking very much forward to playing this deck more to really see what it can do with the negates gone. Another deck I wanted to mention is the Memento deck. Obviously, it just won the YCS. I personally don't even own any of the cards, but I wanted to mention this deck is so strong. Obviously, it proved itself with the decks we are going to be playing this format at full power. Again, don't sleep on Memento. The deck is solid. Dweller being banned is going to change a lot of things about the format, and one deck that can benefit from that as well is one that kind of fell out of popularity, and that is going to be the Yubel deck. Again, another deck that can abuse the Fiendsmith engine, and hands down, going first, this deck probably puts up some of the best first turn boards compared to any of the decks in the game right now. The only downside is there's a lot of hand traps, especially the Charmies, that really hurt this deck, and while the only hit to this deck really is the Phantom of Yubel going to 1, this deck really has legs, especially considering how consistent it is. There's a lot of room for non-engine, and I'm not going to talk about it too much, but I definitely could see myself experimenting with this because there's really not a reason it can't thrive in this format. You just have to have a game plan for all those Charmies, which really is the downside to some of the other decks we'll talk about a little bit later as well. I will say one deck that I'm really looking forward to playing, especially post-Alliance Insight, is the White Forest Azamina deck. Again, another deck that gets to abuse the Fiendsmith engine, but this is one of the funnest combo decks that I've been able to play, especially recently on stuff like Master Duel. Again, Post-Alliance Insight, this deck gets some new support as well that looks really crazy, and I would love to get my hands on those cards as soon as possible. I'm actually currently waiting on some of my missing White Forest cards to come in the mail, so look forward to a deck profile coming out in the future. I am so excited to get my hands on them. Obviously, Malice and Ryziel are the talk of the town, but I definitely think this is a sleeper pick going into the next set. We have the Chimera deck that not only has some really great first turn boards, but again uses the Fiendsmith engine very easily. And another deck I'd love to experiment with is going to be the Unchained deck as well. Hands down, one of my favorite decks to play grind games with. It's so technical and it's so much fun to play. The fact that Shavara is now at 2 is so relevant for this deck. Being able to keep them in circulation constantly is so important, with the only downside being that, of course, the Unchained deck really struggles with the Charmies as well, as mentioned with some of the other decks. So as long as you have a game plan for those cards post side, by no means is it going to be one of the top 5 decks of the format, but if you have access to these cards and you're just itching to play, go ahead and play them, because I definitely think they can compete with what we have in front of us. And the Chimeras, again, another deck that I am looking forward to messing with even more. And while it's never been the best deck of the format, it's super consistent, and unfortunately there's not as much room for non-engine, but any deck that has access to Fiendsmith is obviously going to be able to succeed this format, so don't be afraid to try them out. I'm definitely looking forward to doing so. Another personal favorite deck that I love playing is the Labyrinth deck, and again, this is technically something that can be playing the Fiendsmith cards. I personally don't think that's actually the route you need to go with this deck, because I think having a heavy trap lineup not only just flows with the deck better, but it's actually an amazing option into some of the top decks of this format. As we've recently seen in the most recent YCS, we had a top 8 finish of a trap Labyrinth deck. This deck just plays on a different axis compared to the other decks of the format, and for that reason, while this won't be the deck that takes the meta by storm, it's one of those decks that, if not respected, could beat any deck at any time in this format, so definitely keep it in mind when trying to choose something to play. And the last deck, I feel like I had to mention it just because it had success last format. It's the Fire King deck. I mentioned this in my last ban list video. I thought the deck would do pretty decent as well. Obviously, it won a YCS, and that doesn't mean it's going to dominate the format going into it, but I will say, now that Abyss Dweller is banned, it just makes it easier for this deck to thrive. So if you're comfortable with the cards and a good pilot, of course, I think you should definitely give the deck a shot, because it's one of the more budget-friendly options as well going into this next format. So that's going to wrap things up for today's video. Thanks again for tuning in. It's been a while, and I'm so glad to be back, and thanks for sticking around while I was gone. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel, and again, comment down below if there's any other decks that you're excited to play with at this format as well. But here's hoping to see you guys on the next video. Peace.